Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Aspen Security Forum. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend David Rohde of the New Yorker and Dina Temple-Raston, investigative correspondent for National Public Radio. I told David and Dina, we were talking just before this session, that as a career diplomat, a career foreign service officer, when I hear the term deep state, and that's the title of our panel today, fact or fiction, is the deep state real? When I hear that term, I think about some thuggish authoritarian regime, Turkey in its worst days, Egypt under the dictators like Mubarak. I don't think of the United States of America. And as we begin today, since David and Dina are both really respected members of the American Press Corps, I just want to say how much we respect the press. The Aspen Security Forum would not work without journalists. Nearly all, not all, but nearly all of our sessions are chaired by journalists. And I think as a citizen, one of the saving graces of the United States is the First Amendment, the power of the press. I felt in government as a State Department spokesperson that the press was doing its job to challenge me and challenge my colleagues in the administrations in which I worked. And when we talk about deep state, we should never talk about the American Press Corps, because the American Press Corps is just part and parcel of our democracy. Dina Temple-Raston is going to chair this. As I said, she's an investigative reporter, very experienced for National Public Radio. David Rohde is here to talk about his new book on the deep state. I met David a long time ago during the Bosnia War. I met him after a very tragic and unfortunate incident when he was kidnapped by the Bosnian Serbs, by Karadzic and Mladic, and held for 10 days, mercifully released. He lived to tell the tale. He was also kidnapped, as many of you know, by the Taliban in November 2008 and held for 7 months. I don't know any other reporter who's been kidnapped twice, risked his life to tell the story to the American people, and what a career he's had. David won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Srebrenica massacre of July 1995, the worst war crimes in Europe since the Second World War. He's won the George Polk Award, a very distinguished award for foreign reporting. A longtime New York Times correspondent, now with the New Yorker. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation to talk about the deep state. And the last thing I'll say is I defended the press corps. I also want to defend the men and women of the US Foreign Service. When I heard President Trump say at a press conference, with the whole nation watching, when he called the State Department the deep state, it was a disgraceful moment for the American presidency, because these are men and women of the Foreign Service who take an oath to the Constitution to serve their country. There's a lot of risk involved. And I just wanted to pay tribute both to the Foreign Service and to the press. David and Dina, as I turn this over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What I wanted to start with, if I could, do I get in a big screen? Does Nick go away? What do I do? I think I just go
Dina, I'm
fire
going to
away.
go away and make this.
I'm happy to have you there, but excellent. Okay, so David, let me just start. I think that for most of us who have been following foreign policy for some time, this idea of this deep state, as Nick Burns said, as Ambassador Burns said, was sort of something that we associated with authoritarian rulers. Is the deep state in the United States a thing, a real thing, or is it sort of a figment of some people's imagination?
My first answer to that will be that it is a very real thing to the American public. And the poll numbers show this, and these polls are sort of a wake-up call to members of the national security establishment, that are watching this, and also to journalists, to mainstream journalists. I worked, as Nick said, at the New York Times and the Christian Science Monitor and the New Yorker. The American public doesn't trust us, doesn't trust the government officials, doesn't trust the CIA and the FBI, and it doesn't trust journalists like us. I started writing this book because there was a poll I found that came out in the spring of 2017, and 70% of Americans said they believe that groups of unelected officials and generals had too much power in Washington, that they were secretly influencing American government policy. So yeah, I never use the term deep state. It really hasn't been used in the United States until the Trump presidency. but we have a problem. And it would be naive of us to blame all this on Donald Trump. We need to think about how government officials and how journalists are communicating with the American public and how we can rebuild their, and regain their trust.
So you said 70% of the people polled thought that there was some sort of deep state. Were you in part of that 70%, or were you in the 30%?
This is a good journalist, doing tough interviews, so I deserve every tough question I get. Look, the book concludes that I don't like the term deep state. I think it's political rhetoric, and I think it's a very effective tool that President Trump has used to discredit government officials, even members of his own administration, who contradict the president's narrative or political talking points. That said, there is a permanent government. I use the term institutional government that exists, no matter who is the president. There's countless laws and procedures that are supposed to keep them all from being political. I agree with President Trump that unelected government officials should carry out the orders of elected presidents. If they are legal and ethical orders, government, officials have to carry them out. We can't have, the will of the people being ignored after an election. But there is no deep state in the way Donald Trump uses the term. It's an exaggeration that he uses to discredit rival sources of information, and he uses it for political gain.
Well, so what's the difference between something like the deep state and Eisenhower's military-industrial complex?
So what's fascinating is that the government is feared on the right and the left, but they use very different terms. Liberals use the term you just mentioned. Liberals talk about the military-industrial complex. They fear a cabal of generals and big defense contracting firms that they feel are driving the country into war after war after war. Conservatives, a better term, a term they often use is the administrative state. That would be this ever-growing government that's incessantly invading our personal lives and taking away our freedoms and the personal information we should control. But there's a funny thing right now, we can talk about more of this later, there's sort of an agreement on both sides. There is one thing that the right and the left agree on these days, and that's how do we control these agencies? How do we control the big private companies that are collecting our data in the digital age and kind of maintain privacy while also, securing the country?
And do you think there's an agreement that these technology companies need to be controlled?
Yeah, we saw that, recently, and this is, one thing since I finished the book. We just had this hearing last week with the big tech companies, 4 companies that are worth nearly $5 trillion in value. Conservatives feel that they are censoring them. Liberals feel that they're not doing enough to stop the widespread, conspiracy theories that are online. And the second issue that makes this so important right now is the pandemic. We cannot get a consensus among Americans about how to counter the pandemic. How many people are dying? Conservatives think the government count is exaggerated and higher than it should be. Liberals think the government count is under what it should be. And, if, by some miracle there is a vaccine, I think we're experiencing an enormous crisis of information right now. And part of it's online, part of it's the press not performing well. But, if we can't agree on basic information and basic facts, people will refuse to take the vaccine. On both the left and the right, they won't believe government experts saying this vaccine can help you, not harm you.
Well, I think what's very strange about being a journalist today in this current environment is that in the old days, you used to get 2 administration officials who were in the room to tell you what happened. Maybe they didn't talk to each other. Maybe they were on opposite sides of the table. And this was enough for you to say, okay, I know what happened in the room. I can report it. But now these 2 administration officials may be completely honest. They may have leaked to you just the way you like it as a reporter. And then the administration says it never happened. How do we deal with a problem like that when you're talking about this information problem, this journalistic problem? I'm glad I'm not covering the White House right now. I don't know how I would do it.
I think and I tried and thought about this a lot in working on the book. So I want to repeat my core finding. There is no deep state in the way Donald Trump uses the term. He is using that term for political gain, and he's spreading conspiracy theories about a deep state that doesn't exist, again, for political advantage. So that is my finding. his claims about a deep state, which started with just the CIA and the FBI. When Pentagon officials, when President Trump was questioning some war crime investigations that were being carried out against soldiers, President Trump called the Pentagon the deep state. And now you have, Dr. Tony Fauci and CDC officials being called members of the deep state by the president's supporters. So it is important to call out falsehoods. I admire Glenn Kessler's work and the Washington Post work of the fact checker. The facts he looked at his findings matched mine. So I think calling out false statements and exaggerations is key. I also think it's important, though, to not, there's plenty of columnists and they can say mean things about, the president or members of the House and the Senate. As reporters, though, we shouldn't get into the name calling and get trolled and exaggerate our findings. So if that makes any sense, like declare, false statements false, but don't spin and get caught up in the whole opinion
Sure.
cacophony that is just dominating so much today in the news media.
Yeah, it seems to me, I wonder what you think about whether Bill Barr is somebody who you believe is a proponent of this idea of the deep state. And in the book, you talk a lot about the idea of the deep state being very married to this idea of presidential power and what the executive's power should be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, President Trump uses the term deep state for political advantage and to unfairly discredit others. Bill Barr, throughout his career for decades, has believed that the presidency was weakened too much after Watergate. He wasn't alone. There was a group of conservatives, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, who worked, with President Ford, felt it had gone too far. So did Ed Meese. So did Antonin Scalia before and after he became a Supreme Court justice. So there's a school of thought that the War Powers Act, the church reforms, we can talk about more, the creation of its Senate and House Intelligence Committees to control the CIA, the creation of inspectors general, of independent counsels, people like Robert Mueller. There's a view that all of those things weaken the presidency. And Barr, laid this out, very articulately and clearly in a speech he gave to the Heritage Foundation last fall. He said that this country needs a strong presidency to survive. He argued that if you look at American history, the Great Depression, World War II, some would argue right now the pandemic, the branch that saves the country when it faces a crisis is the presidency. It's the only branch that can act decisively and help save people in peril. And he believes that it's still weakened, that the presidency is too, far weaker than it should be, that all these investigations of Trump are just preventing him from using his justified executive powers. And let me just say, many other scholars I spoke to think that's a very extreme interpretation, that Bill Barr is wrong. The presidency regained the power it lost after 9/11, and Bill Barr is creating a dangerously high level of power right now for President Trump.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier about the effect that the deep state is having on the pandemic as we see it now. And part of the sort of undercurrent that you haven't actually said explicitly here, but you talk a lot about in the book, has to do with the distrust of experts and how that is sort of part and parcel of this idea of being against the deep state. Can you talk about how that has affected the pandemic and how we might be able to change the narrative before, if we actually have a break between the first wave and the second wave of the pandemic, how we might be able to change that narrative ahead of a second wave?
So I talked to, and none of this is in the book, but I'm working on this topic still and trying to write about it. A former White House official told me that the president, like many, conservatives and Republicans, felt that the private sector could respond to the pandemic quickly and more effectively than government agencies, and that's very common. But beyond that, the president, Trump does distrust government experts. President Trump doesn't really believe that, this is one interesting aside I got from an aide, that there are nonpartisan public servants. He doesn't believe that anyone is sort of truly nonpartisan. He thinks that government officials like one president more than another and work harder for some presidents more than others, that these bureaucrats like slow roll proposals they don't like. And, there's no question that, government officials fight turf battles. They want their agency to get more money and get the top billing and the best coverage. and that they leak to influence stories. Every president, to be fair to Trump, has come into office and said, they didn't trust government bureaucrats. Ronald Reagan felt the State Department officials weren't implementing his efforts to get tough on communism. Barack Obama didn't trust the Pentagon. He felt that generals were leaking possible troop increase numbers for Afghanistan and boxing him into a troop increase that was larger than the one he wanted. But again, no president has accused, career government officials, call them bureaucrats, a more pejorative term, of carrying out a coup against them. Donald Trump is the only president who has accused government officials of carrying out a coup, and I found no evidence whatsoever of that. And I had current Trump administration officials say to me, "You're right, there is no coup. The president I serve is exaggerating."
Right, and so how do we change this narrative, David? How do we make it? I don't want to say more positive because that makes me sound Pollyanna-ish, but how do we get it back something closer to reality, I guess?
I think we got to, journalists and members of Congress and have to respect the public suspicions that are out there. Don't dismiss all these online conspiracy theories. They're widely believed. I start the book talking about the Church Commission, which was created in the late 70s after Watergate, and then the Church Commission exposed this just rafts of abuses by the CIA around the world and inside, by the FBI in the U.S. itself. It was John Tower. Church was a Democrat, Frank Church from Idaho, John Tower, a Republican of Texas. And people can laugh at this, but it was a bipartisan investigation. It stuck to facts. I mean, clearly there's politics in all situations. We haven't had a sort of bipartisan investigation in years, but there have been successful investigations. The Iran-Contra investigation, the report was accepted by most Americans as factual. The 9/11 Commission, dealt with a national crisis and proposed reforms, and those reforms were carried out. So we need some kind of commission like the church reform, journalists to work like I've talked about, like sticking to the facts and not getting caught up in the kind of partisan brawl. That generation, the post-Watergate generation, had lost credibility with the American public. They regained it. There was folks who, William Webster took over the FBI and revamped it and wasn't anywhere near, reversed many things J. Edgar Hoover did. So it's possible. And I think that that's what needs to happen today. And just back on the bipartisan issue, there's a funny alliance in the Senate. Rand Paul, the conservative libertarian, and Ron Wyden, the liberal Democrat from Oregon, both agree privacy is a huge issue. This came up in the tech hearing. It was just this last week, Republicans and Democrats actually agreed that we're way behind in legislating for the digital age. We need rules of the road for how we protect our privacy, how we secure the country, and there is a way for Democrats and Republicans to agree on this and move forward.
Well, there's a tiny glimmer of optimism. We're going to be taking questions now from the audience, and I just want to remind the participants that you can raise your hand to ask a question, even though we're virtual. Normally, I would call on you in the back of the room at Aspen, but I have this background so that we can feel that we're in Aspen. You're inside.
Nice.
So, okay. So, I guess, Vegan Jodi, do you have a question for us?
Hi, thank you so much for giving us, and David, really enjoy or deeply appreciate your book. Great discussion. My question is, not everybody has the resources or intention or time to fact check everything which comes across their feed, and social media is a huge platform for getting information. People get a lot of media information from Facebook, social media, such. What's your recommendation regarding people not just imbibing whatever comes on a social feed, but fact checking or having critical thinking before they ingest and make decisions based upon things they see on social media?
Aside from listening to NPR or reading The New Yorker. Yes.
Oh, yes, actually, I love NPR. Thank you, Dina, for bringing it up. I love
plug. Okay.
NPR is the answer. Vegan, this is a fantastic question. Let me just, you probably know this already, and many people might know this, but I think Section 230, which gives Twitter and Facebook and Google and all these online platforms, they have no legal liability for false statements and slanderous statements that are posted on Facebook and Twitter and all these online platforms. If Dina, slanders someone in her story, if I slander someone in a story in the New Yorker, I can be sued for libel. Some argue those laws are too loose. So I would realize that absolutely everything you're seeing online has not been fact-checked at all. And then this will sound hokey, but I mean it. If you are conservative and you're seeing these crazy things in your Facebook feed and you're not reading them in the Wall Street Journal, I would use the Wall Street Journal's news pages as your guide. What you're seeing on Facebook is false. The Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch. He also owns Fox News. Clearly, their editorial page is deeply conservative. If it's not in the news pages of the Wall Street Journal, it is false. And there's a value to journalism. Again, we have a crisis of information right now across the world. It is leading people to die during the pandemic and could lead to more people to die. If you're liberal and it's not in the pages, the news pages of the New York Times, and you're seeing it online, whatever you're reading, the conspiracy theory, the crazy claim about Trump, it is probably false. The New York Times would print it and if they're not printing it, it's not, they haven't been able to verify it. And it's kind of silly, like I'm not saying, trust the mainstream media, but we spend enormous amounts of time vetting stories, making sure we have multiple sources. And I know the president has intentionally tried to discredit us, but, and we've made mistakes. We make mistakes all the time, but lawyers read every story that appears in the New Yorker. And I think, I don't have an answer, but some forms of that danger of being sued has to be shifted over. So there's some form of vetting going on by Twitter and Facebook. Again, these companies are worth nearly $5 trillion now. I love the web. We shouldn't try to restrain it too much, but there has to be some sort of system to force them to the service they're providing. They're providing information to the American public. It shouldn't just be completely unvetted information online.
And I should just say, Section 230 is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically tells internet companies that they're just a platform and don't have editorial content. Therefore, they're essentially made immune from the kind of libel suits that you or I or our organizations might be open to. So our next question is for Drew Dornstadler. Go ahead, Drew. Did I butcher your name so much that you don't know who you are? Drew Dornstadter?
It's the dramatic NPR pause.
It is. This is the one thing we're worried about.
Not at all, Dina and David. Thank you both. You didn't butcher my name. I'm honored to speak with you.
Our names are butchered all the time too, and hard to pronounce. So.
No, thanks for your patience. I've got this question for employees of those departments in the executive branch that receive this sort of negative attention. Do you think those employees, do you think the departments have a responsibility to dispel these beliefs? If so, how? If not, what do you think the consequences are? Thank you.
A big focus on my book was the FBI, actually, and I think the quick answer is they do have a responsibility, and it's really important because I believe there can be nonpartisan public service. I believe there can be, nonpartisan journalism. And I believe I may regret this, but someone should sue me if they feel I've slandered them or been on, and it meets that legal standard. It's a good check that keeps me in balance. So I spent a lot of time around FBI agents. One of the main characters in the book is an FBI agent named Tom O'Connor. He was a cop in Western Massachusetts. He joined the FBI just before 9/11. He was actually sent to Kenya to investigate the bombings there. He embodies public service to me. He investigates the bombings also of the USS Cole. He responds to the Pentagon on 9/11. He and his FBI colleagues collect 3,000 bags of human remains from the Pentagon so that those families will know what happened to their loved ones. He serves in Iraq, and he investigates the Blackwater shooting in Baghdad that killed Iraqi civilians. And in the last part of his career, he investigated racially motivated white supremacists in the US. So Tom O'Connor is a character in the book. He recently retired. He was the head of the FBI Agents Association. They're the closest thing they have to a union. And, you know, what scared me is that when I would talk to these, you know, FBI agents and other career officials was a sort of growing cynicism. And they weren't sort of mad just at President Trump. They were more and more kind of disgusted with our entire political system and very alienated from it. And so I think if these departments don't stand up for employees, you're going to have less people wanting to get engaged in public service. And so, you know, Tom O'Connor recently retired, and I said to Tom, well, what are you going to do now? Would you ever consider, you know, running for office and kind of cleaning up this mess in Congress? And Tom said, no, I want to do something that has meaning to it. And that's a terrible, terrible sign of the state of our democracy, you know, if that's how he feels after decades of service to the public. So it's important to protect government servants. It's important to police them. The Hatch Act, you know, all these things that are designed to prevent them from being political, but we have to defend them. We need them. We need Tony Fauci's, you know, experts who serve the public for decades and can help us when we face crises that we just don't expect.
We've got, I think, just time for one more question. And my old friend Brian Fix apparently is raising his hand. Brian?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Good to see you both. And Dina, all my best. The question is, with social media now using tweets so often, are tweets presidential papers? Must they be preserved? Can they be deleted? And what liability does any public official have after he's out of office for his tweets?
I'm no legal expert, but as a journalist, I would say yes. If anything, I want more records retained and more transparency. One of the disturbing trends in the Trump administration has been less transparency, you know, defying congressional subpoenas. And I would urge intelligence officials, current and former, and law enforcement officials, current and former, that are watching this, to be more transparent. You saw how when Edward Snowden leaked, you know, what was going on, all of those surveillance programs that Snowden talked about had been approved by the FISA court, had been approved by federal judges. But that showed you how deeply distrustful the American public is. So I'd urge you, I'm biased as a journalist, current and formal intelligence and law enforcement officials and government officials, to preserve records, to make more records public. You know, secrecy and blanket secrecy just undermines public trust in you and in all of, you know, in our democracy. So yes, preserve those tweets. They're very important public statements, and future generations need to see them.
So we've got a written question from Todd Rosenblum, and I'll just read it in my best radio voice. You said career officials must follow the direction of the president, which implies civil service servants are not governed by rules, laws, and policy, that they do not require them to execute lawful direction by political appointees. Do you have any evidence of this?
I might have misspoke earlier. I guess what I was saying is that there was some like talk when President Trump took office that, you know, government officials in the EPA shouldn't sort of carry out his policies, or in DHS, and so I might not even be misunderstanding. I mean, many characters in the book and they talked about the policies and procedures you're talking about, the Ethics in Government Act, the creation of the Senior Executive Service. So all those rules should be followed. I think they are mostly followed. And again, President Trump is exaggerating the idea of these rogue government servants. But I think at the same time, if an official, you know, feels they can't serve a president, that just personally, it's better for them to resign than to, you know, I'm not even saying this is happening, but it's better for an official to resign than to block or slow roll or sabotage a policy that they don't like personally. Go ahead, Dina.
And that's not new to the Trump administration, right? I mean, we know that a lot of what happened with James Comey and John Ashcroft and Director Mueller in that hospital room, what was threatened was that they would resign. And these threats of resignation actually sometimes do stop policies that maybe aren't wise from going forward.
Yes. We need all parts. We need bureaucrats or officials that are carrying out policies, and then elected officials with fresh mandates every 2 to 4 to 6 years.
Okay, I think Nick Burns is back. Did you want to have some final comments, Nick?
I wanted to actually ask two reporters a question. We're supposed to end at 3:15, but let's take a couple of more minutes. We can do that. I'm going to date myself by saying that when I came of age as a teenager, college student, the press was widely respected. Woodward and Bernstein uncovered the Watergate scandal. Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley, I'm really dating myself, were very much
Just kidding.
respected figures. And that's no longer the case. I mean, part of it is the explosion of information. It's hard, there were very few outlets for information back then. Part of it is this attack on the press by politicians, mainly from the right, not just from the right. And so how do you carry on, Dina, David, in a climate like this? And are you just reconfirmed in your career choice and the mission you have to tell the truth as you see it, or does it affect the way you work?
Do you want to go first, David? How about we'll give you the last word, and I'll just say that, so I teach at media law at Temple Law School with my husband. And what's really stunning to me as we talk about media law and we talk about Section 230 and things like that, is how little today's, so they're a little bit older because they're law students, today's students understand about what we do in terms of journalism. I mean, we go through the process. My husband takes the sort of legal aspect of it, and I take the practitioner aspect of the First Amendment. And they didn't know what we did as a living. They thought we just wrote what we wanted to write. And they had no idea that there was an editorial process, or that you have an editor that you have to say, yes, it's an unnamed source, but this is who it is, and this is how they know it. And I confirmed it with this person, and this is why they don't want to use their name, particularly in the current administration. So I think there's a little bit of a lack of understanding of what we do for a living, which has allowed forces that are against us to paint us as just pundits spouting off. And I think that needs to change. I think people need to understand a little bit better what we do for a living, as what you mentioned, David. I think that's one of the things. I don't know that, this is a great time to be an investigative journalist, to be frank. There are stories everywhere. There are just not enough hours in the day to do them. And that's not because we're gunning for anyone. It's because our job is to shed light on things that are not being done the way they're supposed to be. And there are a reasonable amount of things like that that are going on right now that are just not opinion, but true, just absolutely true. The facts show it.
Thank you, Dina. And David, as we ask for your comment, I think Dina's right. A lot of people don't understand the difference between the opinion page and the news pages. I read most days the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. And frankly, when you read the news stories, if you were blindfolded just listening to these reporters, you wouldn't know who was reporting for the Journal or the Post or Times. Obviously, the editorial pages are significantly different, but I'm not sure that's understood by a lot of people. David, how would you answer that question?
I think there's been a failure in journalism of explaining that more clearly, and there's been an explosion in pundits. And I'm not against pundits, but I think there was a collapse in our business model, and so the answer was to tilt right or tilt left and to shout loudly. And we found that false statements and conspiracy, theories travel farther and faster online and on air than kind of balanced reporting. And I think we're finding our footing. We're succeeding as organizations, the New York Times and the Journal and even the New Yorker now. So I think it's to be a reporter and be a pundit, and not to mix the two. And it's too easy on social media to kind of sound off and say something quickly. And I tried very hard in this book to be fair, and I still try to be fair to President Trump. I mean, I think when he says a false his fake news and his claims that we're making things up are false. I think people are seeing that as time goes by. They're seeing it in terms of the impact of the pandemic. And I love being a journalist. I have no second thoughts about it. It's a calling and an honor, and I'm just lucky to be included today and to be part of this profession.
Well, David, all best with your book. I'm going to read it. I hope everyone watching this is going to read it. And Dina, all best to you, and thank you both for enlightening us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the Aspen Security Forum.